Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Phil Mackintosh, chief economist at Nasdaq, to discuss how the rapid spread of COVID-19 makes increased lockdowns and a second economic slowdown more and more likely, at least in the Europe and U.S. We'll also take a look at data that suggests masks and stopping superspreader events until a vaccine is available at mass is going to help stop the spread. But Phil, let's take a look at our first couple of charts here. That the data is concerning.
That's for sure. And it's the reason the markets have been selling off the last few days as well, because Europe has now got 140,000 new cases, which is way above the levels that the US has ever seen. So it's a big concern. And Europe, we already know, is starting to shut down parts of its economy. And we know what happens when you have to shut down your economy and quarantine people. So that's going to be bad for GDP. We had started to expect a pretty good V-shaped recovery. And remember, all the data just keeps surprising to the upside. It's much less bad than we had been thinking. But as winter has kicked into the sort of Western economies, it does look like the cases are picking up. Even in the US, hospitalizations are increasing. There is already some stories about specific regions in the US where hospitals are pretty much at capacity for COVID. So it's not good in terms of what it's likely to do in the next couple months in the US and in Europe, both big drivers of the global economy.
Well, Phil, also let's take a look at this GDP chart here, and we can see that China is faring the best. In fact, most of APAC is doing better than the Western countries, and that's the concern. They seem to have had this under control. So if there's any sort of resurgence there, that's the shockwave that concerns me.
Yeah, I kind of look at this chart a bit differently, and I think we've all been through the exact same thing. Coronavirus doesn't care what country you live in. How come Asia, as a general region, has done so well at dealing with COVID? And really, it's kind of what you started talking about. They were pretty quick to put on masks. They were pretty quick to focus their quarantines and make sure that they stamped out the coronavirus. They have testing in Taiwan as you come into the country. They've made a much better tracing program than anywhere in Europe and the States. And so they know what's going on. They have much better control of the people that are positive. They're better able to keep them out of society, stop it from spreading as badly, and get on with their economic life. And that's, unfortunately, we saw it in some data talking about 1918's flu. But what you see is the looser your quarantining and social distancing requirements, the short-term impact is better for the economy, but the long-term impact is much worse. And we're starting to see that now in the Western economies.
And of course, the question is, when will a vaccine become available? That's the key.
Yeah, and even some of the administration are now saying that that's kind of what we're hinging our hopes on. That's the one thing we can control is the vaccine. And I guess there's good news on that front, because if you'd asked people 6 months ago, there was a pretty broad consensus it was going to be 2022 or later. Whereas what we've seen now is a lot of people think it's going to be Q1 next year, or at least sort of the middle of next year, where it'll be broadly available. And broadly available is good. That means it's not just emergency workers that are getting it. It means we're getting enough people vaccinated that we can probably start to think about going back to normal life.
And Phil, what's so interesting here is we started to see more travelers go through the airports, and they're actually doing a pretty good job with containing COVID spread.
Yeah, super interesting, right? I mean, air travel was one of those activities that we saw just really struggling in the COVID environment. It hasn't picked up as nearly as much as restaurants or retail. It's kind of languishing, but we did hit a milestone last week where we had 1 million travelers, which itself is pretty phenomenal because there's only 320 million, 330 million people in America. So that's a lot of people traveling on any single day. But what's interesting is there's also started to be some research coming out about travel and air travel. There's a couple of different studies. So one study that's really interesting came out of Hong Kong, which has much better testing and tracing. And they've been testing everyone that arrives and tracing what happens. And they've actually found that since mask wearing was required on a lot of flights, those flights with compulsory mask wearing have had very few COVID spread, even when it was found that somebody on a flight had useful. And it also proves that flying doesn't need to be as dangerous as people think. There was a statistic out there that only 44 people have spread COVID out of 1.2 billion passengers. So there is a lot of data coming out that says there are ways to live with COVID on a plane that's pretty safe. Most of the spread cases that we read about earlier were before masks were being worn. And so that kind of highlights the fact that masks, to your point, are a really important way of containing the spread.
Yeah, and Phil, I mean, to hammer the point home again, because science does matter at the end of the day, our last two charts here, there's data out of Carnegie Mellon and Credit Suisse. I mean, they're both reputable, research outlets. It shows masks work. Even your last chart here has some math involved with it. I mean, it can't be any more clear.
Yeah, I mean, the chart from Credit Suisse is super interesting because it actually shows that it's most common that someone with coronavirus doesn't spread it to anybody else. But what happens is the super spreader events spread it to so many people that actually that makes up most of the spread cases. So it's really important that we do stop those super spreader events. And we're starting to realize what they are. It's things like weddings and funerals, going to bars and nightclubs, choir practice, maybe motorcycle rallies, even events out in the garden when you're looking for a SCOTUS. So I think it's really important that we just make sure we don't have gatherings of lots of people without masks on in close proximity. And that seems to be what the science says. And it would make it much easier to contain coronavirus if we all did that. It's a relatively small sacrifice to make for a lot of economic gain.
Agreed 100%. And we'll just have to use some personal accountability here, at least in the U.S. anyway. Phil, thanks for joining us on Trade Talks.
You're welcome, Jill.
And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.